Good morning, students. I hope you're doing well. Now, in yesterday's class, we had covered the Surat split and the significance of the Swadeshi movement, and today we are going to carry on with the Indian Councils Act 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. Okay. What were they? They were a new set of constitutional reforms drafted on the basis of the recommendations of a committee set up by the Secretary of State for India Morley and the Governor General of India Minto. And hence the final drafted version were known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. Okay? Now, what were the circumstances under which these reforms were introduced? What was the background of these reforms? That becomes important to understand. Okay? So in the recent years, a few important developments had taken place, such as the Swadeshi movement, which had resulted in the intensification of nationalism, that had exerted higher pressure on the British to satisfy nationalist aspirations. Okay? The government hoped that the new set of reforms will be able to achieve this, and the rising tide of nationalism could be stemmed as a result. Secondly, in the backdrop of the Swadeshi movement, certain promises had been made to people such as Gopal Krishna Gokhale in particular and the moderates in general, right? So promises of liberal reforms to the moderates had to be fulfilled. Okay? Thirdly, new opportunities had emerged for the British to divide and rule Indians. In the shape of the formation of the All India Muslim League, with its demand of separate electorates for Indian Muslims. And the British wanted a new constitutional mechanism to exploit this opportunity. Okay? The Indian Councils Act of 1892 was supposed to do this as well. A long-standing demand of the Indian nationalists had been responsible self-rule. In fact, the Congress had formally raised the demand of Swaraj in 1906. Now, the British wanted to do as little as possible towards the achievement of this objective, but they wanted to create the impression that they were serious about this. Okay? So, the British desired to create the semblance or appearance of introducing a responsible government but their real intentions were something else. While expanding the apparatus of constitutional autocracy. Okay? So Indian nationalists had been berating the British, criticizing the British for misruling Indians, not living up to the ideals of British liberalism, not governing India in the same manner that the people of Britain proper were being governed, and that is why the British wanted to create the appearance of introducing constitutionalism, but in reality they wanted to strengthen the apparatus of their constitutional autocracy. That means give themselves constitutional power, deprive Indians of any meaningful power. Okay? So these are the circumstances or backgrounds behind or within which the Indian Councils Act came in. Clear hai itna? Now the important provisions. First of all, the size of the Imperial Legislative Council, that is the Central Legislative Council, and Provincial Legislative Councils was increased. Okay? So once Imperial Legislative Council and several Provincial Legislative Councils, इनके sizes increase किए जाएंगे. सब points लिखो. The Imperial Legislative Council was to retain an official majority. Next subpoint. The provincial legislative councils were to have a non-official but non-elected majority. Provincial legislative councils were to have a non-official but non-elected majority. अब देखो, इन काउंसिल्स में चाहे वो इंपीरियल लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल हो चाहे प्रोविंशियल लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल्स हो, देयर यूज्ड टू बी टू डिफरेंट काइंड्स ऑफ मेंबर्स व्हिच ईच ऑफ व्हिच हैड टू सब कैटेगरीज. एक होते थे ऑफिशियल मेंबर्स who were part of the colonial administration. They were colonial officials. And the other were non-official members who were private individuals not directly associated with administration. ठीक है, तो ये सरकार के पार्ट नहीं होते थे. Among official members there were two subcategories: ex officio members who automatically became part of these councils as a result of their position within the British government. So people such as the Governor General or the provincial governors, the members of their executive council etc., ये सब हो जाएंगे एक्स ऑफिशियो मेंबर्स. तो इनकी पोजीशन वहां पे परमानेंटली फिक्स्ड रहेगी. ऑब्वियसली जैसे जैसे ट्रांसफर्स होंगे, पोस्टिंग्स होंगी, पीपल हु पॉपुलेट दीज पोजीशंस आर गोइंग टू चेंज, लेकिन इतने मेंबर सरकार के इस रूट से आएंगे. ठीक है, सो दे वर एक्स ऑफिशियो ऑफिशियल मेंबर्स. एंड सेकेंड वर गवर्नमेंट मेंबर्स. So these were members from the British government who were nominated to these councils. Clear? Non-official members में once again two subcategories: nominated members were private individuals including both Indians as well as British citizens residing in India who could be nominated to these councils by the British government. समझ में आया इतना? एंड दूसरे होते थे इलेक्टेड मेंबर्स. These were members of the public. These were private members from the common public who were elected to these councils. Clear? Imperial Legislative Council में कौन सी majority है? Official majority. That means the combined number of ex officio and government members is greater than the combined number of nominated and elected members. In the provincial legislative councils कौन सी majority है? Non-official but non-elected members की. That means the combined number of nominated and elected members would be greater than the number of ex officio and government members. ठीक है, तो non-official majority होगी. However, the combined number of ex officio, government and nominated members would be greater than the total number of elected members. Clear है? तो एक तो ये provision हो गया. आगे लिखो. नंबर 2, members had the power to discuss the budget, but could not vote upon it. Members had the power to discuss the budget but could not vote upon it. What was their maximum power with regards to the budget? They could simply suggest amendments to the budget. वो amendments खुद ला भी नहीं सकते हैं, amendments केवल recommend कर सकते थे. Write down. They could suggest amendments to the budget and could demand additional grants for local self-governing bodies and could demand additional grants for local self-governing bodies. ठीक है? So would it be correct to say that there was any effective legislative financial control over the government? नहीं था. क्यों? क्योंकि बजट का एजेंडा आउटले सब कुछ गवर्नमेंट प्री डिटरमिन करेगा. The members could at most discuss the budget, suggest some amendments. तो ये ऐसा भी नहीं है कि these amendments would be compulsorily adopted, and they could also request further demands, grants in aid for the local self government. They did not have the right to enforce it on the government. तो कोई जरूरी नहीं है कि इन रिक्वेस्ट को सरकार मान ही ले. ठीक है? तो this was the second one. Third right, legislators had the power to ask questions and supplementary questions and supplementaries on matters of public importance. On matters of public importance. On matters of public importance. ठीक है? तो सरकार को क्वेश्चन कर सकते थे एंड सरकार के रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ने, मिनिस्टर ने जो भी आंसर दिया है उसके बेसिस पर फर्दर क्वेश्चनिंग भी हो सकती थी. ठीक है? They did not have the power to ask supplementary questions earlier. तो 1892 वाला एक्ट आपने सुना होगा, उसमें ये पावर इनके पास नहीं थी. They simply had the right to ask questions. They would have to be satisfied with whatever response the government representative gave to them. Now they could further question, supplementary questions पूछ सकते हैं. Next provision. The elected members were to be elected directly or indirectly? Indirectly. Were to be elected indirectly. By whom? By the local self-governing bodies. देखो, by local self-governing bodies in case of the provincial legislative councils and provincial legislatures in case of the Imperial Legislative Council. In case of the Imperial Legislative Council, मतलब हुआ कि जो स्टेट असेंबलीज हैं उनके मेंबर्स चुन के आएंगे फ्रॉम द लोकल सेल्फ गवर्निंग बॉडीज हु वुड डिटरमिन कि कौन उनमें से प्रोविंशियल लेजिस्लेचर में उनको रिप्रेजेंट करेगा, ठीक है। तो डायरेक्ट इलेक्ट्रेट के पास ये नहीं जाएंगे। सेकेंडली, in the case of the Imperial Legislative Council, the elected members would be indirectly elected by the provincial legislatures, right? Number 5, one Indian would be nominated to the Governor General of India's Executive Council, ठीक है। And who was the first Indian to be nominated thus? Satyendra Pratap Sinha, SP Sinha. Next, right, number 6, two Indians were to be nominated to the Secretary of State for India's India Council. पंद्रह मेंबर होते थे इसमें, आउट ऑफ दोज देयर वुड बी टू इंडियंस फ्रॉम नाउ ऑन। कौन कौन थे? के.सी. गुप्ता and Syed Hussain Bilgrami were the first two Indians to be nominated. Next लिखो, franchise, that means the right to vote, was limited in nature. That means यूनिवर्सल एडल्ट फ्रेंचाइज जैसा कोई कॉन्सेप्ट नहीं था। बेस्ड ऑन प्रॉपर्टी एंड एजुकेशनल क्वालिफिकेशंस। बेस्ड ऑन प्रॉपर्टी एंड एजुकेशनल क्वालिफिकेशंस, ठीक है। एंड लास्टली राइट डाउन separate electorates were granted to कौन किसको? सेपरेट इलेक्टरेट सबसे पहले किसको दिए गए? मुस्लिम्स को। बट अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट, अब देखो केवल मुस्लिम्स को देते तो द एजेंडा ऑफ द ब्रिटिश वुड हैव बीन क्लियर टू ऑल कि ये डिवाइड एंड रूल का पॉलिटिक्स करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं। Therefore, some other groups were also grouped in with Muslims. These are also minorities whose interests need special protection, and thus we are providing them separate electorates as well. To zamindars, the chambers of commerce at Bombay, chambers of commerce at Calcutta, and Indian Mussalmans. These four groups were granted separate electorates. But यहाँ पे real intended beneficiary कौन था? The Indian Mussalmans, right? This was a British plot to play the politics of divide and rule. ठीक है? So these were the important provisions of the Morley-Minto Reforms. Now their critical evaluation. ठीक है? Was this act able to satisfy the aspirations of the nationalists? No. In this regard, it proved to be an utter failure. The Morley-Minto reforms failed to satisfy Indian nationalism due to the following limitations. Due to the following limitations. क्या limitations दिख रही हैं आपको यहाँ पर? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल इंडियंस का डिमांड क्या था? स्वराज और रिस्पॉन्सिबल सेल्फ रूल. बट यहां पे कोई स्वराज का नामो निशान आपको दिख रहा है? नहीं. द इंडियन डिमांड ऑफ responsible self rule had been completely overlooked. Had been completely overlooked. Secondly, रिस्पॉन्सिबल गवर्नमेंट का बेसिक टेनेट क्या होता है? द प्रिंसिपल ऑफ कलेक्टिव रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी. दैट मीन्स द गवर्नमेंट शुड बी रिस्पॉन्सिबल टू द इलेक्टेड रिप्रेजेंटेटिव्स ऑफ द पीपल. अब यहाँ पे ना रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है ना रिप्रेजेंटेशन है पीपल का. इन द काउंसिल्स देयर इज ईदर एन ऑफिशियल मेजॉरिटी और अ नॉन इलेक्टेड मेजॉरिटी. सो ट्रू रिप्रेजेंटेशन नहीं है. एंड द लेजिस्लेचर्स also lack legislative and financial control over the government. ठीक है? So write down the principle of collective responsibility which is the bedrock of a popular democracy was completely absent. सब पॉइंट्स लिखो, A and B. A, the legislatures had a majority of official or appointed members. And B, they lacked financial or legislative control over the government. So, since there was no collective responsibility, there is no question of popular democracy. ठीक है? Third shortcoming, the existence of voting qualifications also weakened the notion of popular sovereignty. ठीक है? So, for the people to be actually sovereign, every individual should have equal rights, or at least every adult should have equal voting rights, and collectively they should exercise their sovereignty by choosing their representatives. However, this mechanism, the Morley-Minto reforms, provided for a very small section of the Indian population being eligible to vote. That means popular sovereignty was replaced by a kind of oligarchy of a small minority, of an elite minority. So in voting qualifications की वजह से popular sovereignty का जो notion था, that was also violated. ठीक है? Fourth लिखो, the governor, the provincial governors and Governor General of India continued to exercise a wide array of discretionary powers such as the power to issue ordinances, such as vetoing of any and all bills, such as the power to certify any bills, etc. ठीक है? So through these powers they could completely bypass the legislatures. तो यानी कि legislatures का actually कोई role था ही नहीं in the governance of the country. Fifth लिखो. Now, Indian nationalists, right from the foundation of the Congress, had been demanding Indianization of the civil services, reduction in the military expenditure and administrative expenditure. यहाँ पे कोई ऐसे provisions आए थे? नहीं. Write down. The act also failed to satisfy the demands of Indianizing the civil service and reducing military and administrative expenditure. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट लिखो. It also failed to reduce the burden of taxation on peasants or provide protection to Indian industrialists or Indian industries. Provide protection to Indian industries. Next लिखो. It also failed to address the issue of home charges and the most egregious of these failures क्या था? There had been a long-standing demand of Indian nationalists that the expenses of the Secretary of State for India and his council must be separated from the Indian budget. तो उसके जो भी salaries and expenses incur हो रहे थे वो Indian budget से निकाले जाते थे. That means Indian taxpayer was footing the bill for these British officials and their ministry working in England. This act had the opportunity to address this. उसके बजट को इंडियन बजट से सेपरेट करने का opportunity था बट वो नहीं किया. ठीक है. Write down. In fact, even the demand of separating the expenditure of the Secretary of State for India and his council from the Indian budget was ignored. Was ignored. ठीक है. And finally, The most destructive provision of this act, what is it? Why are the Morley-Minto reforms remembered most? No, for the separate electorates. Okay? And you can write the introduction of separate electorates as the basis for minority representation institutionalized communalism in the words of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So later, while talking about the separate electorates, Pandit Nehru ने बोला था that their introduction as the basis of minority representation in India institutionalized communalism in India. Communalism क्या होता है ये तो समझ में आता है ना? That political terms में that means the perception that the political interests of different religious communities are mutually exclusive and competitive against each other. ठीक है? And separate electorates ने according to पंडित नेहरू इस feeling को institutionalize कर दिया. That means communalism was transformed from a social phenomena into a constitutional phenomena. It had the backing of the constitution of the day. The political machinery of that period was responsible for enforcing it. ठीक है? तो एक तो ये नुकसान हुआ इसका. Tangible terms में कैसे मैनिफेस्ट हुआ ये? Write down. Separate electorates emerged as a sticking point between the Muslim League and Congress. ठीक है? So especially during the later stages of the national struggle, both the parties became adamant on this issue. Congress wanted its abolition, Muslim League wanted its preservation. Muslim League in fact used the Congress's opposition to the practice of separate electorates to convince ordinary Muslims that the Congress is actually a anti-Muslim party. Thus, religious rhetoric was introduced into the situation simply because of this flawed principle. ठीक है? Next sub point लिखो. Now, community representation के कई सारे basis हो सकते हैं. For example, Supreme Court of India following independence has recognized social and educational backwardness of any community as a valid basis for granting them reservation. अब reservation के साथ आया क्या? Reservation का demand. As reservation was granted in public employment or in education to a particular community, other communities also started to demand it. ठीक है? तो वो खुद में एक political agenda बन गया. Similarly, separate electorates initially granted to Muslims now became an enduring demand of certain other groups as well. And is this going to be conducive for unity, or is it going to lead to further division? Further division. Write down. Other groups also began demanding separate electorates. Also began demanding separate electorates, causing further division within the Indian body politic. Within the Indian body politic. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. सेपरेट इलेक्ट्रेट्स, इसका ग्राउंड लेवल पे क्या इफेक्ट पड़ता था इन दोज कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंसीज व्हिच वर सेपरेट इलेक्टेड कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंसीज? It had the effect of disenfranchising a vast majority of the electorate, right? Had the effect of disenfranchising a vast majority of the इलेक्ट्रेट. क्यों ऐसा बोल रहे हैं हम? देखो, सेपरेट इलेक्ट्रेट कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंसी है, मान लो दिस इज अ सेपरेट इलेक्ट्रेट कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंसी व्हिच हैज बीन डीम्ड टू बी अ मुस्लिम सेपरेट इलेक्ट्रेट कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंसी. नाउ यहाँ पर पॉपुलेशन का डिवीजन कुछ ऐसा है दैट आउट ऑफ द टोटल पीपल हु आर एलिजिबल टू वोट 70% are non-Muslims while 30% are Muslims. Majority में कौन है, non-Muslims या Muslims? Non-Muslims. Now क्योंकि ये separate electorate constituency है for Muslims, the representative जो भी यहाँ पे इस पूरी constituency को represent करेगा वो एक मुस्लिम ही हो सकता है. That means other are ineligible to contest the elections. But even more dangerously, only Muslims of this constituency will be eligible to vote. So the electorate is going to consist of exclusively Muslims and the representative is going to be exclusively Muslim. यहाँ तक का तो समझ में आता है, कोई बात नहीं, तो नॉर्मल रिजर्वेशन होता है, चल सकता है, राइट. बट बाय डिसएनफ्रेंचाइजिंग द वास्ट majority separate electorates, is it going to create goodwill among the two communities or is it going to create greater rancor? Greater rancor. This group is going to feel disenfranchised, it is going to feel cheated कि हमारे साथ कुछ गलत हुआ है. And this kind of political machinery is going to create ill will at the ground level. The two communities are going to clash with each other during the 1920s and 30s. Series of communal riots होंगे, and this is further going to sow the seeds of enmity between the two communities. The common people of the two communities are going to gradually start believing कि आगे हम दोनों का गुजारा एक साथ नहीं हो सकता है, ठीक है? And this would lead to the idea of separatist politics gaining currency. Suddenly somebody is going to float the idea that India is not actually a single unified nation, Rather, it is a country with two separate nations, the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation. And these two communities actually deserve to have two separate nation states. तो टू नेशन थ्योरी का आइडिया, सेपरेटिस्ट पॉलिटिक्स का आइडिया, पाकिस्तान डिमांड का आइडिया यहीं से इमर्ज होकर के आएगा, और एटलीस्ट इमर्ज होकर के नहीं आएगा तो दोज आइडियाज आर गोइंग टू बी फैसिलिटेटेड बाय द कांस्टेंट प्रेजेंस ऑफ दिस टेंशन at the ground level. ठीक है, vast majority of the electorate thus causing conflict, anger and ill will. Conflict, anger and ill will. ठीक है, उसको वोट करने का राइट ही नहीं है. ठीक है, तो सेपरेट इलेक्ट्रेट का मतलब होगा, अगर मान लो एक मुस्लिम सेपरेट इलेक्ट्रेट कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंसी है कि वहां से रिप्रेजेंटेटिव तो मुसलमान ही हो सकता है, तो कोई भी हिंदू खड़ा नहीं होगा, कोई भी सिख खड़ा नहीं होगा, बट उसके साथ जो मोर डेंजरस प्रोपोजिशन है कि कोई और कम्युनिटी का मेंबर उसके लिए वोट भी नहीं करेगा. ठीक है, सो एक्चुअली जो इलेक्ट्रेट है उसको ग्राउंड लेवल पे ही डिवाइड कर दिया गया है. दैट इज व्हाट सेपरेट इलेक्ट्रेट मीन्स. तो इट कॉज्ड conflict, anger and ill will. Gradually, this feeling fueled the ideas of separatism, the two nation theory, and the Pakistan demand. Ultimately resulting in a series of communal riots and partition. ठीक है, and these wounds have deeply scarred the people living across the Indian subcontinent. Many of us still carry these scars in our hearts and souls. Many people were directly affected by this violence and continue to be affected by the memory or the after effects of this violence, and thus the damage done by the separate electorates has resonated throughout the entire century following its introduction, and अभी भी कोई end नजर नहीं आ रहा है साइट में. So you can further write next subpoint. In fact, even post independence, the Indian subcontinent continues to remain deeply scarred by the ghost of separate electorates. फुल स्टॉप, सेम पॉइंट में कंटिन्यू करो। द generational trauma of the separate electorates continues to affect the present day society, which has still not been able to completely overcome not been able to completely overcome communalism. ठीक है। इनफैक्ट कुछ लोगों से पूछोगे तो आपको ये बोलेंगे कि इंडिपेंडेंस के दौर से ज्यादा कम्युनलिज्म तो आज एग्जिस्ट करता है। नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो और नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो। It was due to this that Morley later commented with regards to the separate electorates that we have sown dragon's teeth. And the harvest is bound to be bitter. तो सरकारी इंसान जब रिटायर हो जाता है उसके पास टाइम ज़्यादा हो जाता है रिफ्लेक्ट करने के लिए, तो ही रेमिनिसेस थिंक्स अबाउट द गुड टाइम्स एज वेल एज द बैड अचीवमेंट्स एज वेल एज मिस्टेक्स। तो मॉर्ली लेटर केम टू द रियलाइजेशन की बहुत बड़ी भूल हो गई है। शॉर्ट टर्म गेन्स के लिए अंग्रेजों ने अपनी लॉन्ग टर्म प्रेस्टीज और इंटरेस्ट दोनों को हर्ट किया है, राइट। तो दैट इज व्हाई ही सेज दैट हमने ड्रैगन्स टीथ बोए हैं और जो हार्वेस्ट होगी, जो फसल होगी वो भी कड़वी होगी, दैट इज ऑल्सो गोइंग टू बी बिटर। एंड व्हाट आर द ड्रैगन्स टीथ दैट ही इज टॉकिंग अबाउट? सेपरेट इलेक्ट्रेट, ये तो हो गया जो बीज बोए इन्होंने। एंड which bitter harvest is he talking about? Communal violence, the partition of India, the permanent destabilization of Indian politics or the subcontinental politics, the possibility of a major civil war between the different communities of the subcontinent, जो कि हो भी चुका है in the case of Pakistan 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, and the permanent loss of British prestige and goodwill। ठीक है, तो अभी भी the British have not been able to regain it. Is this clear? ये हो गया इस एक्ट का क्रिटिकल इवैल्यूएशन. Did this act have any redeeming features? Any improvements over the previous act? Yes, थोड़े बहुत थे. For example, the number of members was increased, some additional powers were given, such as the power to discuss the budget, to suggest grants, suggest amendments to the budget, to ask supplementary questions. ये सारे powers नए दिए गए, but these powers were too insignificant in the entire scheme of things. National movement since 1892 100 कदम आगे बढ़ चुका था. The British had moved only one step forward. ठीक है? And thus in the larger scale of things these reforms seemed insignificant. So they could best be ignored. उनके लिए वही कहा जाए तो भी best है. In fact, a more sinister design emerges. The British were simply trying to create the appearance of introducing reform while not actually doing so. In fact, they were trying to introduce more autocratic changes which were you can say disguised as liberal reforms. So that is the more sinister motive. ठीक है? तो next main point लिखो. आपने जैसे हाँ ये लिखा ना, द Morley-Minto Reforms failed to satisfy the nationalism due to the following limitations. वैसे ही नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. The act had a few redeeming features such as a larger legislatures, b the right to discuss the budget and suggest amendments, c the right to ask supplementary questions and d the introduction of elections albeit indirect for the first time. 1892 एक्ट में इलेक्शंस का प्रोविजन नहीं था, चाहे डायरेक्ट चाहे इनडायरेक्ट. अब पहली बार चाहे इनडायरेक्ट ही हो लेकिन कम से कम इलेक्शंस तो इंट्रोड्यूस किए गए. ठीक है? नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. however these reforms were insignificant when viewed in the context of the failures of the act. Further, Further, they reflect the lack of sincerity, on the part of the British, to introduce any meaningful change, सब पॉइंट लिखो. In fact, comma, they reveal a sinister motive, comma, namely the disguising of autocratic changes as liberal reforms, ठीक है? Is this much clear? Next main point लिखो. Perhaps this was why the Morley-Minto reforms remained the shortest lived constitutional mechanism introduced by the British in India. Morley-Minto Act कब इंट्रोड्यूस हुआ था? 1909. नेक्स्ट सेट ऑफ कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल रिफॉर्म्स 1919 में, सिंपली 10 years बाद गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट 1919, ऑल्सो नोन एज दी मॉन्टफोर्ड रिफॉर्म्स. तो 10 साल के अंदर ही अंग्रेजों ने खुद इस वाले एक्ट को डिस्कार्ड कर दिया. दैट शोज दैट दिस एक्ट हैड फेल्ड टेरिबली इन फुलफिलिंग बोथ द इंडियन इंटरेस्ट एज वेल एज द इंपीरियल इंटरेस्ट. क्लियर? ये हो गया दी Morley-Minto reforms. Question: discuss the factors responsible for the introduction of the Morley-Minto reforms. Full stop. Is it true that they institutionalized communalism in India? Question mark. 200 words. Next question. We have sown the dragon's teeth and the harvest is bound to be bitter. Discuss. 200 words. Next question. Critically evaluate the Indian Councils Act 1919, sorry, 1909. Full stop. Did it succeed in fulfilling British aspirations? Question mark. 200 words. क्रिटिकल इवैल्यूएशन तो आप कर लोगे इस एक्ट का. सेकंड वाला जो पार्ट है दैट कैन बी अ बिट चैलेंजिंग. तो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल यू नीड टू आइडेंटिफाई कि ब्रिटिश एस्पिरेशंस थे क्या. व्हाट वर दे? टू weaken Indian nationalism, to strengthen the British Empire. ठीक है. Now when it came to the weakening of Indian nationalism, do you think that the separate electorate plot succeeded? To some degree it did. It divided the nationalist ranks. ठीक है. So that much is true, but in the long term it was also harmful for the British. Why? Because the British had prepared the stage for the organization of Indian politics on the basis of religion, and this provided an opportunity for the future leaders to organize mass movements on the basis of religion, which resulted in greater unity rather than division. So by doing this, the British had opened the gates for a future compromise between the Congress and Muslim League, which also took place in 1916. Following that, the Khilafat movement took place, non-cooperation movement took place, which displayed remarkable Hindu-Muslim unity. So religion became an important basis for political organization. ठीक है. अब अंग्रेजों का दिक्कत क्या था? That they did not share the same religion or culture as Indians, and since religion was a very powerful tool to mobilize the masses, it was possible for the future Indian leadership to mobilize the masses in a very quick and eager manner against the British rule as a whole. तो अपने ही पेड़ पे अंग्रेजों ने कुल्हाड़ी मार ली. It allowed the later leaders to frame the national struggle as a religious struggle against a foreign oppressor. ठीक है. तो शॉर्ट टर्म इंटरेस्ट तो सेटिस्फाई हो गए, लॉन्ग टर्म इंटरेस्ट में अंग्रेज फेल हो गए अपने मंसूबों में. सेकेंडली, टू स्ट्रेंथन द ब्रिटिश एम्पायर, did the British succeed through the Indian Councils Act 1909? They prepared the stage for constitutional autocracy. In the short term, it worked in their favor. Okay? They were able to centralize power in their own hands. They were able to avoid sharing power with Indians. However, this constitutional autocracy created further resentment among Indians. So, instead of being able to satisfy the nationalist sentiment, the Indian Council Act further fueled the rising tide of Indian discontent. Till the time that Indian nationalism remained dormant, Indians का कोई response नहीं आया. However, as soon as the phase of dormancy would end, the Indians are going to rally against this mechanism of constitutional autocracy. तो इन द शॉर्ट टर्म वंस अगेन सक्सीड हो गया था, लॉन्ग टर्म में फेल हो गया. फर्दर, व्हाट डज द एक्चुअल ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ स्ट्रेंथनिंग द ब्रिटिश एम्पायर एक्चुअली मीन? क्या मतलब होगा इसका? जैसे आपको इंडिया के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में अगर सोचना है स्ट्रेंथनिंग इंडिया, व्हाट आर गोइंग टू बी द कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ दिस स्ट्रेंथ? पीस, स्टेबिलिटी, प्रॉस्पेरिटी. ठीक है. Did the Indian Councils Act prepare the grounds for peace, stability, prosperity? No. So in the long term, by depriving India of these things, the British were harming their own interests. By preparing a recipe for conflict, instability and poverty, the British harmed their own long-term interests. And Indians अब और बड़े numbers में ये convince हो रहे थे that the British are never going to be able to give these things to Indians. And thus, in the medium term also, Indian disenchantment grew. तो यहाँ पे आपको एक डिवीजन करना पड़ेगा शॉर्ट टर्म ब्रिटिश इंटरेस्ट और लॉन्ग टर्म ब्रिटिश इंटरेस्ट में. शॉर्ट टर्म में मार्जिनली सक्सेसफुल हुए, लॉन्ग टर्म में कंप्लीटली ब्रिटिश फेल हो गए. कंक्लूड करते समय क्या लिखना होगा? इन द एस्टिमेशन ऑफ मॉर्ले वी हैव सोन द ड्रैगन्स टीथ एंड द हार्वेस्ट शैल बी इज बाउंड टू बी बिटर. उस सेंटिमेंट के साथ आप कंक्लूड कर सकते हो. इज दिस क्लियर? तो ये हो गया मॉर्ले-मिंटो रिफॉर्म्स 1909. नेक्स्ट डेवलपमेंट is the first phase of revolutionary extremism. We are talking about the period from, let us say, 1907-08 right up to the end of the First World War 1919. ऑब्वियसली ये जो डेट्स हैं थोड़ी फ्लूइड रहती हैं हमेशा. ठीक है. अलग अलग हिस्टोरियंस अलग अलग टाइम पीरियड्स असाइन करते हैं इन ट्रेंड्स को इमर्ज या फिर जाने में, इमर्ज होने में या फिर डिसअपियर होने में. ठीक है. सो दिस इज व्हाट वी नीड टू talk about, but before we do that I need a little break. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Sorry about that. Now, who were the revolutionaries? Revolutionaries हम किनको बोलते हैं in the context of Indian history, modern Indian history? Those who resorted to the use of violence for the fulfillment of their political objectives. ठीक है? Now, political objectives Indian nationalists के क्या थे, especially revolutionaries के? The end of British rule. And the independence of India. And what was the method that they chose to achieve this objective? Violence. In the form of assassinations of unpopular British officials and Indian informants. Dacoities or robberies of government cash, arms and ammunition in order to sustain their activities. And military conspiracies, especially during times of war, which involved enlisting the military support of the common enemies of the British and also trying to incite a revolt, a mutiny of Indian soldiers serving in the British Indian Army, both who were actively serving and those who were interred as prisoners of wars in the camps of the British enemies, especially during the backdrop of the First World War. जैसे कि जर्मनी के prisoner of war camps में जो इंडियंस हैं, टर्किश वॉर कैंप्स में, इटालियन वॉर कैंप्स में जो इंडियंस हैं, उनकी मदद को एनलिस्ट करके इंडिया में ब्रिटिश रूल को ओवरथ्रो करने की कॉन्स्पिरेसीज करी जाएंगी. Then the creation of an international network of revolutionaries who could counter the British at multiple fronts, including India as well as overseas. Okay? So these were the methods used by the revolutionaries to counter the British rule. अब क्वेश्चन इमर्ज होकर के आता है कि ये तो मेन स्ट्रीम नेशनलिस्ट भी चाहते थे, एक्सट्रीमिस्ट भी यही चाहते थे. So why did the revolutionaries resort to violence and not mainstream methods? रेवोल्यूशनरी एक्सट्रीमिज्म का इमर्जेंस इंडिया में रियल सेंस में कब होता है? 1907-08 के बाद, राइट? And one of the most important factors behind the rise of revolutionary extremism was the utter failure of mainstream politics. By this point of time, the Indian nationalists had experimented with both the moderate as well as the extremist methods, and both of them had failed. Both of them had failed to yield the necessary results. And this failure of the mainstream politics drove the younger nationalists away from them. It created a sense of disillusionment among the younger nationalists. They had joined the Swadeshi movement with great enthusiasm and hope. They were under the illusion that the mainstream extremist methods would succeed. But the failure of these methods broke this illusion. They convinced them of the ineffectiveness of mainstream politics, and seeing no other option, they took up guns and bombs. ठीक है? तो एक तो रीजन ये था. सेकंड, the failure of the mainstream leadership to do what? To clearly distinguish between revolutionary activity based on masses, based on the activity of the masses, and individual acts of revolutionary heroism. Because the mainstream extremist leaders were not able to clearly differentiate between the two, they were not able to instruct their followers कि दोनों same नहीं है, दोनों अलग अलग हैं. That is why the younger nationalists continued or saw their individual acts of heroism as the continuation of the larger objective of national struggle, of the larger process of national struggle. Failure of the mainstream nationalists to clearly distinguish between revolution based on mass activity and acts of individual heroism. ठीक है? Thirdly, British atrocities misrule and autocracy that the British were misruling India, that they were committing atrocities upon Indians was an open secret. The Indians had launched a powerful mainstream movement to address these. The movement was radical, it was based on the use of extra constitutional methods, but it was never violent, it was always peaceful. The British used their autocratic apparatus to ruthlessly suppress the movement. And what happens when peaceful change becomes impossible? Violent change becomes inevitable. because the British had closed the doors of peaceful progress. They had failed to satisfy the demands of Indian nationalists. They left no other route for the Indian nationalists, especially the younger ones who were filled with national pride, fervor and enthusiasm to channel their energies. अब वो केवल बंदूक ही उठा सकते हैं, उनके पास और कोई ऑप्शन बचा नहीं है. The impossibility of peaceful change made the use of violent means inevitable. ठीक है. Fourthly, these younger groups of revolutionaries also had a certain lack of understanding regarding the true nature of colonial administration. They believed that simply by assassinating a few unpopular British officials, they would be able to improve the condition of Indians, not realizing that the colonial rule was like a complex machinery in which individual officials were like replaceable parts. Destroy one, it could always be replaced by another. Okay? So, in other words, we can say that they did not perceive the systemic nature of colonial oppression. ठीक है. Further, they were also inspired by revolutionaries and their achievements in other parts of the world. In fact, revolutionary extremism was something that was invented by the West to shatter autocratic regimes. The Indian revolutionaries considered revolutionary methodology to be a Western hammer by which they could shatter Western rule in India. These include other revolutionaries around the world include the Irish Republican Army, which was operating in Ireland, and the nihilists of Russia, which had succeeded in completely destabilizing the Tsarist regime of Russia. ठीक है? You can say they wanted to use the Western hammer to destroy Western rule in India. ठीक है. Further, in the recent decades, a cultural change had taken place within Indian nationalism. It had evolved from polite discussions held in assembly halls by educated individuals who sought to negotiate upon different demands of Indians into a more visceral, a more raw and emotional form of nationalism, which had been elevated to the level of religious and cultural, you can say, enterprise, right? And therefore, Indian nationalism, which the younger generation of nationalists subscribed to, was a very powerful and emotional ideology. And this ideology had the power to inspire a spirit of sacrifice, right? कि इसके लिए जान भी दे सकते हैं, right? Inspired a sense of ultimate sacrifice. और अगर जान दे सकते हैं तो जान ले भी सकते हैं, right? And thus political violence came naturally to the young revolutionaries. In fact, they saw it that as their sacred duty to the motherland. ठीक है, तो बाकी सारी चीजें तो आपको हर जगह देखने के लिए मिल जाएंगी, लेकिन ये वाला जो आइडिया है दैट इंडियन नेशनलिज्म में एक तरह की तब्दीली आ गई थी, उसका जो इमोशनल कंटेंट है, जो कल्चरल कंटेंट है, उसमें एक तरह की तब्दीली आ गई थी, which readied a body of patriots who were ready to pay with their lives for the cause of the nation. And if they were ready to give their lives, they were also ready to take lives. They saw this as the supreme act of national and religious service. In fact, इससे ऊपर कुछ और वो कर ही नहीं सकते हैं, right? So it was almost as if they considered it their destiny to die for the motherland and to kill for their motherland. इस तरह का nationalism इंडिया में इसके पहले नहीं एग्जिस्ट करता था, बट ओवर टाइम एंड स्पेशली इन द बैकड्रॉप ऑफ द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट हमने देखा कि कल्चरल कंपोनेंट में कैसे चेंज किया गया है. इंडिया एज अ नेशन इटसेल्फ वाज डेइफाइड. अवनींद्रनाथ टैगोर ने तो देवी से कंपेयर कर दिया, भारत माता का फोटो बना दिया. वंदे मातरम became a popular slogan and song which also evoked the imagery of India as a divine land, right? And it was seen as the divine land for all Indians, और इसके लिए ये लोग कुछ भी करने के लिए तैयार थे. The Swadeshi movement and the developments preceding it, especially under the leadership of cultural personalities and intellectuals like Rabindranath Tagore, had infused the younger generation with a sense of sacrifice, Atma Shakti, self-reliance. So they were not ready to accept the failure of the Swadeshi movement, and they felt it as their sacred duty to continue this struggle. That is why revolutionary extremism is going to emerge suddenly in a major way following the failure of the Swadeshi. इतना क्लियर है? लिख लीजिए इसको. Write down. In the context of Indian history, revolutionaries were those nationalists who were ready to use violence to liberate India from British rule, through assassinations, dacoities, military conspiracies, and creating an international network of revolutionaries against British rule. Network of revolutionaries against British rule. Full stop. Next point. While the use of political violence against British rule was not new, comma, it emerged as a major trend following the failure of the Swadeshi movement. ठीक है. तो अंग्रेजों के अगेंस्ट पहले भी कई सारे रिवोल्ट्स वगैरह हुए थे, तो यूज ऑफ वायलेंस अगेंस्ट द ब्रिटिश वाज नथिंग न्यू बाय इंडियंस, but as organized political activity within the framework of modern nationalism, it emerged as a major trend following the failure of the Swadeshi movement. Next heading though, factors for the emergence of revolutionary extremism. Factors for the emergence of revolutionary extremism. Write down. Number 1, the failure of mainstream politics. Filled the younger patriots with a sense of disillusionment. Full stop. Both the moderates and extremists had failed to make any meaningful progress. Failed to make any meaningful progress. Full stop. This pushed the highly patriotic younger nationalists towards the path of revolution. Towards the path of revolution. Next, number 2. While the extremists had succeeded in inspiring the patriotism of the younger nationalists, they failed to clearly distinguish between revolution based on the activity of the masses and acts of individual heroism. सब पॉइंट लिखो. As a result, following the failure of the Swadeshi movement, the younger nationalists felt it was their duty to continue the struggle individually. So they did not see the end of the Swadeshi movement as the failure of the movement as a whole. They simply saw it as the failure of the mass phase of the movement. मास फेज फेल हो गया है तो अब इंडिविजुअल फेज की शुरुआत होगी, रेवोल्यूशनरी फेज की शुरुआत होगी. नेक्स्ट राइट, नंबर 3. The biggest cause for the emergence of revolutionary extremism was definitely British misrule, their atrocities and their autocracy. सब पॉइंट लिखो. The British had been exploiting India for over a century, resulting in the upwelling of anger and discontent. Next subpoint, their ruthless suppression of previous uprisings had fueled a sense of unfulfilled nationalist aspirations. इसमें से a sense काट दो, had fueled unfulfilled nationalist sensations, nationalist aspirations. Next point, the nationalists had organized the peaceful Swadeshi movement, but the British suppressed it like all previous revolts. Next point, this convinced the younger nationalists that the British are not interested in compromise. Thus preparing the way for direct confrontation. ठीक है? Next point. In other words, by making peaceful change impossible, the British had made the use of violence inevitable. Okay? Next main point, number 4. देखिए, the early revolutionaries also lacked a clear understanding of the true nature of British rule. Full stop. Subpoint. They felt that the assassination of a few unpopular British officials would terrify the British enough to grant Swaraj, would terrify the British enough to grant Swaraj, or to leave India. Full stop. Next sub point. They also felt that this would provide relief, to ordinary Indians suffering under British misrule. Full stop. Next sub point. They failed to perceive the systemic nature of the colonial regime. In which individual officials were no more than replaceable parts in a complex machinery. No more than replaceable parts in a complex machinery. नेक्स्ट लिखो नंबर 5. पॉइंट समझ में आया ना? नंबर 5 लिखो. The younger revolutionaries were also inspired by the activities and achievements of foreign revolutionaries, such as the IRA, that had been battling the British in Ireland, and the nihilists which had been opposing the Tsarist regime, CZARIST, the Tsarist regime. Tsar was the emperor of Russia, उसका टाइटल जार होता था. The Tsarist regime of Russia. ठीक है. Next point. Next sub point. In fact, they wanted to use the Western hammer, within brackets you can write political violence close brackets, to end or to shatter Western rule in India. ठीक है, तो एक ये हो गया. एंड लास्टली लिखो नंबर 6. In the recent decades, comma, there had been a major cultural shift in Indian nationalism. Full stop. Subpoint. The younger nationalists had been ideologically trained to view India as their divine motherland. Full stop. Next subpoint. The spirit of sacrifice was infused in their psychological makeup. The spirit of sacrifice was infused in their psychological makeup. Full stop. They considered it their sacred duty to defend their motherland against a foreign invader. Full stop. Next point. For this, the use of all means including violence was acceptable. Full stop. Next point. Therefore, the use of revolutionary methods came as a natural choice for this group of young nationalists. ठीक है? Is this clear? Take down a question. Discuss the factors responsible for the emergence of revolutionary extremism in India in the backdrop of, or sorry, in India after the failure of the Swadeshi movement. (200 words, 15 marks. तो इसको शुरू कैसे करेंगे? इंट्रोडक्शन में What does revolutionary extremism stand for? मेन बॉडी में the factors that were responsible, जो 6 core set of factors डिस्कस किए उनको इलैबोरेट करना होगा. देन कंक्लूजन में शॉर्ट वर्ड ऑन दी significance of the revolutionaries. क्या significance? That they sustained the struggle at a time when the rest of the national movement was almost lying dormant. ठीक है? They kept the spirit of nationalism alive and inspired ordinary Indians through example that they organized important assassinations and conspiracies that were actually able to threaten the British, especially in the backdrop of the First World War, as a result of which they had to respond. So it was the combined pressure put by the revolutionaries along with the other nationalists that was responsible for future reforms and changes, such as the August Declaration of 1917 or the Montfort Reforms of 1919. ठीक है? तो this is the pattern that we are going to follow. ये हो गए factors. Now some important revolutionary activities and groups. इसको हम दो पार्ट्स में कंसिडर करेंगे. वन, revolutionary activities within India, and second, revolutionary activities by Indians abroad. ठीक है? और ये भी देखेंगे कि इन दोनों के बीच में ओवरलैप भी है. In India, there were 3 prominent centers of revolutionary extremism. One was Bengal, the other was Punjab, and the third was Maharashtra. बंगाल में इन द बैकड्रॉप ऑफ द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट कई सारी समितियां बनी थी. यू रिमेंबर वॉलंटियर कोर्स, वॉलंटियर ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस. वन ऑफ दीज समितियां वाज द अनुशीलन समिति. अनुशीलन समिति was created in Calcutta, but it had branches across Bengal. 2 prominent branches, एक कलकत्ता में एक्टिव था और दूसरा ये ढाका में एक्टिव था. So These were the Dhaka Anushilan, led by Pulindas, and जो Calcutta अनुशीलन था, it had two wings, a mainstream wing जो कि revolutionary activity में participate नहीं करता था, and a secret society within it that was organized around a journal that was published by this secret society known as Yugantar. तो Yugantar group, having leaders such as Barendra Kumar Ghosh, his brother Aurobindo Ghosh, and Jatindranath Mukherjee. ठीक है. Now the revolutionary activities of both groups are going to start becoming active following the failure of the Swadeshi movement. Chief activities of the Dhaka Anushilan: Bara Daketi in 1908 and the Barisal conspiracy. First was a success, second was a failure. Both organized under Pulindas. Bara Daketi mein the kachehri at Bara, where government cash was kept, that was looted by the revolutionaries to organize further revolutionary activities. The other important act was the Barisal conspiracy, where the revolutionaries sought to attack the British armory and loot British armaments and ammunition. This conspiracy, however, was broken up and Pulindas was arrested and deported for life. Yugantar group के important acts: the Muzaffarpur blast in 1908, carried out by Khudiram Bose and Praful Kumar Chaki. Objective क्या था? To assassinate an unpopular and sadistic British judge named Kingsford, who was the district judge of Muzaffarpur. By accident, the two revolutionaries threw a bomb on a carriage that was carrying two English women. They died. Praful Kumar Chaki was was arrested and hanged, while Khudiram Bose committed suicide. In relation to the Muzaffarpur blast, British ने investigation शुरू किया. They found that the Yugantar group was responsible. Barendra Kumar Ghosh, Aurobindo Ghosh and Jatindra Mukherjee were and Aurobindo Ghosh were both arrested, and not Jatin Mukherjee, and tried in a case that is famously known as the Alipur conspiracy case. Barendra Kumar Ghosh was given a life sentence and deported, while Aurobindo Ghosh, इनको conviction तो नहीं हुआ, but he was forced to retire from active politics. संन्यास लेना पड़ा इनको. That is the Alipur conspiracy case. However, even after this, the Yugantar group survived and was able to in fact create an all India network of revolutionaries by getting into contact with other groups which were active across India. In 1912, they made an attempt on the life of Lord Hardinge, the new Governor General of India, as he was going from Calcutta to Delhi in order to take charge over there. 1911 में officially Imperial capital of India had been transferred from Calcutta to Delhi. तो हार्डिंज अपने हाथी से चांदनी चौक से गुजरता हुआ जा रहा था. Over there, two people were waiting for him associated with the Yugantar group. Attack on Hardinge. This was in 1912. Two people responsible, Sachin Sanyal and Raj Bihari Bose. ये बोस है, not घोष. घोष was the moderate president of the Congress in 1907. Raj Bihari Bose is a revolutionary. ठीक है. So while Hardin survived and these people escaped, so Sachin Sanyal as well as Raj Bihari Bose escaped. This was seen as a major success for the revolutionaries. Another plan was the Zimmermann plan, as in 1915. Zimmermann was the German foreign minister who had been approached by some Indian revolutionaries such as Virendranath Chattopadhyay, who had set up the Berlin Committee for Indian Independence. In association with the German government, the Indian revolutionaries had planned to land some German arms in India and incite a general rebellion among Indian soldiers serving for the British India. They had intended to kill a large number of British officials as well as civilians in India and liberate India from British rule. यहाँ पे जो हथियार पहुंचने वाले थे, they were supposed to land at Balasore, and the responsibility for accepting these arms had been given to Jatindranath Mukherjee. And however, the British came to learn about these plans. So कहीं से conspiracy leak हो गया. Jatindranath Mukherjee was surrounded by the British, but he died fighting a hero's death. Okay? Zimmermann plan failed as a result. Punjab में revolutionary activities were organized by Ajit Singh and Lala Lajpat Rai. However, following the arrest and deportation or exile of both these leaders, most of the Punjab revolutionaries were forced to go into exile themselves. A major chunk of them escaped out of India. और कहाँ गए? Canada or USA. ठीक है? And over there they created their own revolutionary organization known as the Gadar Party, which is going to have a major impact on the revolutionary phase during the First World War. देखेंगे कैसे. ठीक है? महाराष्ट्र में revolutionary trends had been present even before the beginning of the Swadeshi movement. For example, the Chapekar brothers had assassinated the plague commissioner of Pune, Rand. Tilak had even been sentenced to 6 years of rigorous imprisonment for defending these brothers in his newspaper, right? However, following the Swadeshi movement, revolutionary extremism reached a new height. V.D. Savarkar and his brother G.D. Savarkar emerged as prominent organizers of revolutionaries. कई सारे revolutionaries थे, उनको common platform पे लाने का काम इनका था. They created two revolutionary organizations. The earlier one, Mitra Mela, in 1899, which was renamed as Abhinav Bharat in 1904. One of the members of the Abhinav Bharat Society, Anant Lakshman Kanhare, in 1909 assassinated the district collector of Nasik. His name was Jackson, following which the government acted and rounded up several members of this society. ठीक है? इंडिया में ये एक्टिविटीज थी. इंडिया के बाहर abroad London, Geneva, Paris, Berlin, and the USA, especially San Francisco. Emerged as important centers of Indian revolutionaries. लंदन में शुरुआत होती है 1905 में. श्यामजी कृष्ण वर्मा established the Indian Home Rule Society of London as a support group for revolutionaries. In Geneva, the revolutionary charge was led by Madam Bhikaji Kama, who formed a common alliance with the French socialists as well, Geneva or Paris. One of the members of Shyamji Krishna Verma's Indian Home Rule Society, his name was Madan Lal Dhingra. He assassinated a British official, okay, in London, following which London became too hot and the members of the Indian Home Rule Society were forced to flee to Berlin, जहाँ पे नई अपॉर्चुनिटीज इमर्ज हुई फॉलोइंग द आउटब्रेक ऑफ द फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर. यहाँ पे लीडरशिप का रोल प्ले किया वीरेंद्रनाथ चट्टोपाध्याय ने. He established the Berlin Committee for Indian Independence and began conspiring with the German authorities to overthrow British rule in India. This committee played an important role in forming the Zimmermann plan, जो हम already discuss कर चुके हैं. And finally, in the USA, San Francisco emerged as an important hub for the activities of Punjabi revolutionaries, who in 1913 created the Ghadar Party with the objectives of inciting a revolution, overthrowing British rule in India, hatching a conspiracy against common enemies of the British, and publishing revolutionary literature, while at the same time seeking to create an alliance with other like-minded revolutionaries and individuals across the world. इनका चीफ एक्ट था द गदर कॉन्स्पिरेसी. यूएस से बैठे बैठे दे गॉट इन कॉन्टैक्ट विद द रेवोल्यूशनरीज ऑफ द युगांतर ग्रुप. राज बिहारी बोस और सचिन सान्याल याद हैं, दोज हु वर इन्वॉल्व्ड इन द अटैक ऑन हार्डिंज. Since they were involved in an all India alliance of revolutionaries, they were contacted by the Ghadarites. Objective क्या था? To incite a popular rebellion by inciting a mass mutiny of British Indian soldiers in Punjab. Simultaneously तीन garrisons में एक armed revolt incite करने की responsibility इन दो leaders को दी गई, सचिन सान्याल और राज बिहारी बोस को. कहाँ कहाँ पे? लाहौर, फिरोजपुर और रावलपिंडी में. However, at the last movement किसी ने खबर पहुंचा दी. The uprising was suppressed before it could even begin. Sachin Sanyal was arrested. Raj Bihari Bose escaped. ठीक है. So these were the revolutionary activities and individuals and groups, right? तो इसका मैं आपको एक नोट बना करके दे देता हूँ. And following this, we are going to talk about the reasons for the decline of revolutionary activity and the significance of the revolutionaries. ये दोनों कल डिस्कस करते हैं. वो जो फैक्चुअल डिटेल्स हैं अभी मैं आपको भेज दूंगा. ठीक है, चलिए देन आई विल सी यू इन आवर नेक्स्ट क्लास. कल एक क्लास रख लेते हैं, सैटरडे है लेकिन हमने इस हफ्ते 2 क्लास ऑलरेडी मिस कर दी हैं, तो एक क्लास टू मेक अप फॉर दैट. Tomorrow, same time, 8 o'clock.